Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 2023 presentation that will allow us to spend some time reading and reflecting on the works of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. My name is Regennia Williams, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president for the Center for the Study of Religion and Spirituality in the History of Africa and the Diaspora. And also as the Distinguished Scholar of African American History and Culture at the Western Reserve Historical Society. So thank you, colleagues at the Western Reserve Historical Society, for joining us this evening. Thanks also to Professor Sherilyn Allen Harris, who is a board member for the RASHAD Center and also one of the editors of a very popular issue of our journal, the Journal of Traditions and Beliefs, and that's the one that was dedicated to the work of Gil Scott-Heron. So please, if you have a chance, take a look at the e-journal for our organization. It's published by Cleveland State University's Michael Schwartz Library. Thanks also to colleagues outside of RASHAD and the Western Reserve Historical Society. We're very happy to have you here. We've got a live audience in the Zoom room. Just want to say that for the record, because I'd like to share the edited version of this brief video presentation, minus our discussion. In case it gets really heated and you need to pound on the table and yell at me, that happens sometimes. But I won't record that part. I'll record what I say, and then we'll see what happens with the other part. Maybe we'll have a chance to meet face to face and record an even livelier discussion at a later date. So again, focusing on Dr. Heschel, we've greeted everyone, but I also want to acknowledge someone who could not be with us tonight, and his name is Rabbi Joel Chazin, and the staff members at Montefiore, where Jewish tradition endures. Rabbi Chazin invited me to speak at Montefiore for a January 17, 2011 Martin Luther King Jr. Day event. And the title of my presentation on that occasion was 1963, a year in the life of a nation, as reflected in the words of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That occasion, January 17, 2011, was my first opportunity to visit Montefiore, and the first time also that I spent any significant amount of time reviewing the speeches for 1963 related to public addresses by Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King. There was a book that I had an opportunity to look at this year that did not exist in 2011. And it's the one that's shown here. This is the cover of a 2019 publication. At the time of my first presentation on King and Heschel, there was no comprehensive biography of a rabbi, but now we have a great big, thick biography. As you can see, it's about 450 pages, focusing on Heschel's life from his birth in 1907 in Warsaw, Poland, to his death in New York in 1972 on December 23rd. So again, there's a lot happening in the history of the literature associated with these two great writers and speakers and theologians, one Christian and one Jewish, but also we just observed, I'm sure you figured that out as soon as I said that he passed away in 1972, the 50th anniversary of the passing of Dr. Heschel. So both Dr. Heschel and King have been gone now from this world for more than half a century, yet their legacies live on in their published work. And both were prolific scholars. So I just want to share with you, just by way of introduction, why I was so focused on 1963. And certainly Professor Allen Harris has probably already figured this out. I'm calling your attention to chapter 10 because it begins with this paragraph. The title, of course, A Sacred Humanism, 1963 to 1966. But the introductory paragraph reads as follows, and this is a direct quote. The year 1963 was a historical watershed for the United States. When highest hopes clash with bitter disillusionment, the presidency of John F. Kennedy and the civil rights movement seemed to become the nation's spiritual barometers. That January, Americans celebrated the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the abolition of slavery. This document signed in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. On June 3rd, Pope John the 23rd passed away, but hopes for the Roman Catholic Church's renewal through the ongoing Second Vatican Council remained strong. Later that summer, on August 28th, more than 200,000 citizens gathered in Washington, D.C. to demand equal opportunity for Blacks and were uplifted by Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. Then, on November 22nd, President Kennedy was assassinated, a catastrophe that threatened to destroy the nation's self-confidence, closed quote. The one other significant thing that the author, Dr. Kaplan, did not mention in that introductory paragraph is that Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King met for the first time in January of 1963 in the city of Chicago at the first National Conference on Religion and Race. And those are two topics that I'd like to focus on a lot in my research and public speaking, and certainly the work for the Center for the Study of Religion and Spirituality in the history of Africa and the diaspora. And I'm sure you already know this term diaspora is a term that we borrow as Africanist and African Americanist from Jewish literature, usually used to refer to Jewish people who are living outside of Israel. When I talk about the African diaspora, of course, I'm talking about African people who are living outside of the continent of Africa. So that would include Black Americans. But here's something that Rabbi Heschel said in that opening address in January 1963, when he would meet Dr. King for the first time. Interestingly enough, the conference in Chicago took place almost 60 years to the date of today. It lasted from January 14th through the 17th of 1963. So Heschel's address was titled "The Religious Basis of Equality and Opportunity." And he started the address this way. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, and I quote, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The outcome of that summit meeting has not yet come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it is easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. And again, this is Dr. Heschel speaking in January of 1963 in Chicago, Illinois. Now, his was the opening presentation, a very young and very dignified and very intelligent and articulate, and by the time he spoke, 34-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. closed the Chicago conference with a bold, authoritative speech entitled "Challenge to the Churches and Synagogues." And I'll pause again to say that January 15th date is significant, certainly to many of us who study the life of Dr. King. He's born January 15th, 1929, but also a member of our audience has a January 15th birthday as well, and that is Professor Sherlyn Allen Harris. I'll go back now to Dr. Kaplan's study of Dr. King. He continues with this discussion by saying, like Heschel, who deplored the mediocrity of institutional religion, King chastised organized Christianity as untrue to its root values. He shared Heschel's central focus on the sanctity of the human being in the eyes of God, saying in part, segregation denies the sacredness of the human personality. Human worth lies in relatedness to God. An individual has value because he has value to God, close quote. So again, just some of the words that frame this discussion of 1963 and the history of the lives of Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I think it's worth noting that Dr. Heschel was more than 20 years Dr. King's senior, but he became one of Dr. King's greatest followers in his lifetime. But again, I'm drawn to their works over and over again, not just in the season of the Martin Luther King Day holiday, but I would have to confess, especially during this season, there's a tendency on the part of a lot of scholars to compare and contrast their works because they marched against the wind, I think it's fair to say. And they made some enemies in the process, but they continued to march for freedom and for peace in the turbulent decade of the 1960s. I want to pause just a minute here to talk a little bit about the sources that I consulted and read in their entirety in preparation for this particular presentation. There is abundant evidence in the sources pictured here to suggest that Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel are two of history's most renowned community builders. They were religious leaders, advocates for civil rights, social, political, and economic justice. They were anti-racist, and by the end of their lives, both were outspoken anti-war activists. The time period for much of their work together coincides with that of the modern civil rights movement, which we usually date at circa 1954, the year of the landmark Supreme Court ruling in the Brown v. Board of Education case. And then that work continues through the late 1960s with Dr. King's assassination taking place on April 4th, 1968. Both King and Heschel were prolific writers who benefited from the work of the earlier activists and scholars that are often referenced in their particular speeches, including those responsible for pioneering work associated with this idea of the beloved community in the second decade of the 20th century. So again, these are the main books. Children's book, As Good as Anybody, a collection of Dr. King's speeches in the center, A Call to Conscience, and then a collection of essays, No Religion is an Island. So more about those in just a moment. But I want to pause for a minute and offer a definition for this idea of the beloved community. Often when someone mentions the beloved community or I see these words in print, I'm immediately reminded of a passage from Dr. King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech, which he delivered after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And of course, they marched almost 250,000 people, about 200,000 of them Black, to the National Mall in the shadow of the statue of Abraham Lincoln, again in 1963, the centenary of the signing of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. King stated on behalf of the approximately 250,000 marches, and I quote, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now and the need to, in the words of a familiar song, let freedom ring." Here is the passage, however, that seemed to speak directly to this idea of building a beloved community. King said, in part, "I have a dream that one day down in Alabama with this vicious racist, with this governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little Black boys and Black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers." And he continued later in the speech by saying, "From every mountainside, let freedom ring." And when this happens, and when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state, and every city. We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, and we know the world, I'm pausing, Dr. King didn't say this, but let's put a pin there for a moment. We know even in 1963, the world was a lot more diverse than this image that Dr. King puts before the 250,000 Americans who assembled before him at the National Mall in the shadow again of the Lincoln statue. But we will be able, again, getting back to the text, to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last, close quote. Now, again, that's the passage that reminds me of this idea of the beloved community, a nation that was certainly divided along racial lines, even though he uses this gendered language and talks about Black men and white men. There are a lot of women in the Black and white communities and other communities in the United States who are separated from each other along ideological lines and class lines. But again, when true freedom comes in this community that Dr. King described in August of 1963, those divisions will go by the wayside. Now, as it turns out, however, the beloved community and this idea that Dr. King is pushing predates the 1963 March on Washington by more than 50 years. Philosopher Josiah Royce coined the term in the early 20th century to denote an ideal community. In 1913, Royce wrote, "My life means nothing, either theoretically or practically, unless I am a member of a community." Royce observed that besides the actual communities we experience on a daily basis, there was also an ideal, beloved community made up of all those who would be dedicated fully to the cause of loyalty, truth, and reality itself. Royce was a founding member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, often abbreviated with the acronym FOR. And this is an organization that Dr. King joined as a young adult. King frequently used this idea of a beloved community to describe a society of justice, peace, and harmony, which can be achieved through nonviolence. And that information comes from the website for the King Center. I want to suggest in this evening's presentation that a close reading of several written sources and a careful examination of an iconic photograph allows readers and viewers to achieve a better understanding of the roots of the 20th century ideas that influence King's thinking about the need for a beloved community, the level of interreligious and interracial support for the historic Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights, the outcomes associated with this march, and challenges that activists faced in the 1960s and that they continue to face in the 21st century in their efforts to complete the building of the beloved community. So again, a little bit more about these three sources. The one on the left is a children's book that is a beautiful photograph, but again, based on the iconic Black and white image of the front row for the line of march for the Selma to Montgomery March, and that's in Alabama in March of 1965. So again, Alabama Voting Rights March is the theme for this image, and it's among the most reproduced images from the civil rights era. And I'll show you just a detail from the Black and white image in just a moment. But it has inspired, again, many other works, including the color image of the many great leaders on that front row. We'll name some of them once we get to the Black and white version of that. But this color image, again, is on a children's book. The second is in the center here is Dr. King's address at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. That's, again, it's a short piece, one that you could probably read in about 20 minutes, you know, if you're not stopping to take notes. But it's one of the works that's included in A Call to Conscience, the cover of which is shown here in the center, the landmark speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And again, it also includes, as you might imagine, the 1963 I Have a Dream speech that we just quoted from. And last but not least, on the far right is Rabbi Heschel's essay, No Religion is an Island, originally published in Union Theological Seminary Quarterly Review in 1966. It's the first chapter in the book, the 1991 collection, as shown here on the far right, No Religion is an Island, subtitle, Abraham Joshua Heschel and Interreligious Dialogue. So again, those are the three written sources, one children's book in its entirety, and then two lengthy speeches, later published as essays, but the 1965 concluding speech for Dr. King after the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights in Alabama, and then Dr. Heschel's speech, No Religion is an Island. Congressman John Lewis contributed to the introduction to Dr. King's anthologized address at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. And again, that's the title that's given to that address in the anthology of Dr. King's speeches. And there is a very young John Lewis shown here on the far left. Again, the detail from the iconic photo. Let's see if you can see the pointer. That's John Lewis there, right? Just before we have the crop line for the photo. And at that time, 63, I think he would have been about 22 or 23 years old. He went on to become the youngest speaker at the March on Washington gathering in August of 1963. But he's quite an interesting person. And again, at the publication date for the King anthology of speeches, he was a congressman from Georgia. In the Selma to Montgomery March photo, again, shown on the far left, this is the information for the introductory note that he provided to the book. Dr. King came to Selma, Alabama, he says, on March 8th, 1965, as he had done on so many occasions before. He issued a nationwide appeal for religious leaders to come to Selma and to walk the same path we had taken on Bloody Sunday. And again, let me put a pin there. Those of you who know the history of the various marches associated with stepping off at the Edmund Pettus Bridge will recall that on March 7th, Bloody Sunday, John Lewis was among the victims, let me say that, of law enforcement officials. He had a concussion at the end of the day because the peaceful marchers were attacked by officers of the law, many of them on horseback, many of them wielding billy clubs and other weapons and using tear gas to disperse the peaceful marchers. But again, Dr. King calling on religious leaders to join him and John Lewis and others, and completing that march once they get the official permission to do that, and to try to make sure that it's going to be a safe march, because it's going to be a 4-day march before Dr. King delivers that concluding address. But in the introductory note, again, we have John Lewis saying, "I will never forget as long as I live when more than 10,000 of us began our march from Selma to Montgomery 2 weeks later on Sunday afternoon, March 21st. So again, it's 2 weeks officially after that first attempt on March 7th in 1965. Now, in addition to Reverend Lewis on the far left, you will see, if we go further to the right, this is Ralph Abernathy, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, one of Dr. King's closest lieutenants. This is, of course, Dr. King. This is Dr. Ralph Bunch, and this is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So there are lots of stellar individuals, religious leaders, male and female. The sisters who found a place in the front row were from the congregation of St. Joseph. I don't know as much about them. There are no book-length studies about that I've encountered about the women who were leading the march in 1965. But I hope to know more about them the next time I begin to focus on what happened that day and the place of that march in American and global history. In describing this whole experience of marching from Selma to Montgomery, Rabbi Heschel said, and he is often quoted in writings about him, "I felt like my legs were praying." At the conclusion of the 4-day march, Dr. King included the following statement in his address, saying in part, "Our whole campaign in Alabama has been centered around the right to vote. In focusing the attention of the nation and the world today on the flagrant denial of the right to vote, we are exposing the very origin, the root cause of racial segregation in the Southland. Racial segregation as a way of life did not come about as a natural result of hatred between the races immediately after the Civil War. There were no laws segregating the races then. As the noted historian C. Van Woodward in his book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, clearly points out, the segregation of the races was really a political stratagem employed by the emerging interests in the South to keep the Southern masses divided and Southern labor the cheapest in the land." And again, those are Dr. King's words. Later in the address, he says, "Let us therefore continue our triumphant march to the realization of the American dream. Let us march on segregated housing until every ghetto of social and economic depression dissolves, and Negroes and whites live side by side in decent, safe, and sanitary housing. Let us march on segregated schools until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past, and Negroes and whites study side by side in the socially healing context of the classroom. Let us march on poverty until no American parent has to skip a meal so that their children may eat. March on poverty until no starved man walks the streets of our cities and towns in search of jobs that do not exist. Let us march on poverty until wrinkled stomachs in Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are realized and revitalized, and broken lives and sweltering ghettos are mended and remolded. Let us march on ballot boxes until brotherhood becomes more than a meaningless word in an opening prayer, but the order of the day on every legislative agenda. Let us march on ballot boxes until all over Alabama, God's children will be able to walk the earth in decency and honor." In ending his address, King borrows lines from the battle hymn of the Republic, and he had done this before. He closes by saying, "Glory, hallelujah, glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on." On August 6th, voting rights advocates claimed a significant victory in America when President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. So some might argue that the marching of those thousands of people who took that 4-day journey from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965 was the marching then, not in vain. I want to focus for a minute here on Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and this idea of interreligious dialogue and the civil rights movement. So I just want to do a quick comparison between the detail from the actual black and white photograph where you see a little bit of Ralph Abernathy, but certainly Dr. King and Ralph Bunche and Dr. Ralph Bunche and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. But I love the way the artist caused Dr. Bunche, to take a step, to the rear. Not that his works are any less than the works that we have access to, the legacies of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. But again, the book focuses on these two religious leaders, and Ralph Bunche is really not a religious leader, but he's got his own claims to fame. We'll talk perhaps a little bit more about him in the discussion period. But again, putting Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel almost shoulder to shoulder, but certainly indicating that they're arm in arm or fist in arm with Dr. Ralph Bunche. But again, the subtitle for this book, As Good as Anybody, it's Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Joshua Heschel's amazing march toward freedom. But again, a very iconic photo. I would be surprised if there was anybody in the audience who has not seen this black and white photograph, the larger version with John Lewis on the far left, but just wanted to call that to your attention. And now we can continue. Approximately 9 months after that historic Selma to Montgomery march, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel delivered his inaugural lecture as the Harry Emerson Fosdick visiting professor at New York's Union Theological Seminary. He was the first non-Christian scholar to serve in that capacity. And I think it's worth noting that the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Union Theological Seminary are right across the street from each other, have been for years, but no non-Christian had ever been on the faculty of the Union Theological Seminary. Things have changed quite a bit in both institutions since 1963. In the opening passages of that lecture that Dr. Heschel delivered, he demonstrated his complete understanding of the significance of his life and work as a 20th century Jewish American and a faculty member at UTS, again, Union Theological Seminary. And he began by saying, and I quote, "I speak as a member of a congregation whose founder was Abraham, and the name of my rabbi is Moses. I speak as a person who was able to leave Warsaw, Poland, the city in which I was born, just 6 weeks before the disaster began. My destination was New York. It would have been Auschwitz or Treblinka. I'm a brand plucked from the fire in which my people were burned to death. I'm a brand plucked from the fire of an altar of Satan on which millions of human lives were exterminated to evil's greater glory, and on which so much else was consumed. The divine image of so many human beings, many people's faith in the God of justice and compassion, and much of the secret and power of attachment to the Bible, bred and cherished in the hearts of men for nearly 2,000 years. I speak as a person who is often afraid and terribly alarmed lest God has turned away from us in disgust and even deprived us of the power to understand his word," close quote. And I want to pause there just for a minute and look up from the script, because one of the criticisms that I've encountered in my reading, and again, there's a lot that I have not read about Rabbi Heschel, but one criticism is that the rabbi didn't talk enough about the Holocaust. And I don't know what people wanted him to say. His father had died early in the 20th century as a result of the influenza pandemic of that era. And almost every woman, his sisters, his mother, all of them died as a result of activities associated with the Holocaust. And it gives me pause. And including tonight, you know, and I have to stop and I have to look up directly into the cameras what I'm trying to do in making this point tonight, because I don't think I will ever teach World War II in the same way again, because I have said in the past, rather matter-of-factly, that September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, is usually looked upon as being the official start of World War II. Well, again, that's when the Polish-born Rabbi Heschel makes his way to the United States, as he said, barely escaping just by 6 weeks the Holocaust that was to come. And although he said in this speech that his destination was New York, actually he ended up getting a job in Ohio, in Cincinnati. And I'd like to think that there were some people here in the Buckeye State who helped to save his life by making it possible for him to work in Ohio. And back again to the text. As someone who had risked his life many times in the struggle to help defeat anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism in America, he included loyalty to the US Constitution among his many loyalties described in this speech. And he stated, and I quote, "My life is shaped by many loyalties to my family, to my friends, to my people, to the US Constitution, etc. Each of my loyalties has its ultimate root in one ultimate relationship, loyalty to God. The loyalty of all my loyalties, the relationship, is the covenant of Sinai. All we are, we owe to him." And the him in this instance is God. "He has enriched us with gifts of insight, with the joy of moments full of blessing. He has also suffered with us in years of agony and distress." Close quote. So there's a lot more to this speech, but again, to those secular individuals in the audience, and especially in the Jewish community, who would ask the question, where was God when millions of his children, his Jewish children and others, were being slaughtered during the Holocaust? Rabbi Heschel said again and again that God suffers with his children. He suffered with us, he said in 1965 in delivering this speech, in years of agony and distress. That said, Rabbi Heschel continued to believe that human beings could actually help transform even the most unjust societies. And he concluded his lecture with the following words: "What then is the purpose of interreligious cooperation?" And again, there were a lot of divisions within those communities associated with the daughter religions of Judaism, and that would be certainly Christianity and Islam, and certainly many things that Jews and Christians could not agree on, even though Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King were marching almost side by side in 1965 here. But we do need, he says, interreligious cooperation in order to bring about the creation of this beloved community and a just society. It is neither to flatter nor to refute one another, he said, but to help one another, to share insight and learning, to cooperate in academic ventures on the highest scholarly level. And what is even more important, to search in the wilderness for wellsprings of devotion, for treasures of stillness, for the power of love and care for man. What is urgently needed are ways of helping one another in the terrible predicament of here and now, by the courage to believe that the word of God endures forever, as well as here and now, to cooperate in trying to bring about a resurrection of sensitivity, a revival of conscience, to keep alive the divine sparks in our souls, to nurture openness to the spirit of the Psalms, reverence for the words of the prophets, and faithfulness to the living God. Close quote. Now, I want to conclude by inviting you to join me in reflecting on the ongoing march toward freedom in the promised land of equality. Perhaps we'll find it here in the United States of America. Certainly, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that some of the major victories of the civil rights era, including the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in the Brown versus Board case in 1954, that these victories that were claimed in Dr. King's and Dr. Heschel's lifetimes, they were significant. And they include also the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I must also admit, however, that activists, elected officials, and other Americans continue to struggle to eliminate failing schools, entrench poverty, and overcoming challenges associated with providing safe drinking water, affordable health care, and restoring faith in the electoral process. All of these things are issues that the Reverend Dr. William Barber still trying to address in the 21st century in his work with the Poor People's Campaign of our time. And of course, there are people who are struggling for their very lives here in this country, including those individuals who associate with the Black Lives Matter movement. I certainly wanted to share this image today and talk a little bit about it and perhaps more in the discussion period, because this is an image that was captured by a member of the African American Archives Auxiliary of the Western Reserve Historical Society, and here in Cleveland, Ohio. Again, it's an image of Cleveland's free stamp sculpture in downtown Cleveland near City Hall, in a park that's adjacent, in fact, to City Hall, but captured after the May 30th, 2020. Maybe I shouldn't call this a protest, maybe I can call it an uprising. I know better than to call it a riot, but it followed the murder of George Floyd on the Memorial Day weekend, May 25th of 2020. This is an image from the following Saturday. And again, Stephanie Barron, who is the second vice president of the African American Archives Auxiliary, was living in downtown Cleveland, and she has some powerful images from that day. So again, the violence that was visited upon George Floyd, people who are dying as a result of gun violence at the hands of police officers and others in positions of authority. Those are things too that we're especially concerned about as people continue to march toward that promised land of freedom and justice and equality and jobs, economic freedom, but certainly life itself. I want to end by this portion of the presentation by offering these suggestions for further reading, listening, and viewing. On the far left is a cover of a wonderful volume of the Aperture magazine, published in 2016, edited by Harvard University's Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis, who is just a brilliant young scholar. Doctorate, she's got degrees on top of degrees, but certainly advanced degrees in the study of African American history, African history, as well as art history. And she's doing incredible work at Harvard University and throughout the global community, wherever there are audiences that will receive her, and in virtual spaces as well. But again, vision and justice. This publication and these beautiful images associated with this Aperture publication, inspired by the words of the person on the far right. And that's Frederick Douglass, who for a time was known as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. But in freedom, he chose a new name for himself, and that's Frederick Douglass. And he too was a prolific writer and very outspoken abolitionist in his day. But the speech that he delivered in 1861, titled Pictures and Progress, he had some amazing things to say about the power of photography to transform both the individual, who could strike poses as commanding as Frederick Douglass. And Douglass often looked directly into the lens of the camera. I mean, it's the kind of gaze that could, and it could and did, cost Black people their lives. You know, to look into the eyes, especially of white people in the American South. But he did that time and time again, so much so that he was the most photographed American of any race in his time. And he lived from circa 1817, 1818 to definitely 1895. But again, this speech, if you have a chance, there's PDFs of this all over the internet, pictures and progress, but the power of images to shape opinions and change minds in the United States. It's a skill that he had mastered in his lifetime as the most photographed American in the 19th century. In the center, if we can go back, is Amanda D. King. She is the creative director for Shooting Without Bullets. She's also an award-winning photographer and an artist who works with other media. But again, she was my teacher this past summer for a faculty seminar that I participated in at Case Western Reserve University, where she's an alumna of the law school there. Her bachelor's degree she earned at Bryn Mawr. But she's just a brilliant person with a degree in art and, again, the degree in law from Case. She introduced me to the works of Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Lewis at Harvard, and certainly this amazing publication, Vision and Justice. And last but not least, I want to quote Frederick Douglass, and this is from 1857, who said, among other things, in that year, in that era of division that led to the outbreak of the Civil War in April of 1861, and I quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." And so, although the civil rights era, many people will argue, officially ended with the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968, we have in the work of photographers Amanda King and Daniel Levin abundant evidence to suggest that there are various struggles that continue to our day, including struggles for civil rights and human rights. And those struggles are documented in their works. This is going to sound like a commercial, but let me just say it anyway. I'm the moderator for a panel presentation that will feature Amanda King and Daniel Levin at the Maltz Museum in Beechwood, Ohio on Richmond Road. And again, the title of the presentation, Changing Lenses, Activist Photography of Amanda King and Daniel Levin, Sunday, January 22nd, 2023 at 3:00 p.m. Again, in person, better than the virtual stuff if you want to get up close and personal with the photographers who will be in the room. This afternoon, we had 18 reservations. Would be nice to double that number by Sunday. I know there are a lot of people who are interested in their work. And as you can see here, the admission for the general public's only $10 and $5 for museum members. But for the people who are part of the audience tonight, if you think this is something that you would like to participate in, please let me know. You can put a message in the chat and you can be my guest, right? I promised that I was going to buy a half dozen tickets and invite people to come with me. So if you're among the first 6 people to reach out to me, certainly I'll make sure that there's a ticket available for you. If you have not met Amanda King and really witnessed the power of her work, please know that she is just incredible. She's one of the 9 photographers that we honored at the Western Reserve Historical Society on Thursday, September 1st of 2022, which was the anniversary of the birth of the late, great Alan Eugene Cole. And we were celebrating 2022, 2023 as the centenary of the opening of the Cole Studio in the Fairfax community on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio.